Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Drew Watson. I'm delighted to be with you today here in the beautiful Park Avenue Armory. We have an amazing lineup in store for you this afternoon. As you know, the topic for the discussion this hour is on art and succession. So we're going to be exploring this idea from a couple of different perspectives. But essentially, it's when thinking through the visionary collector who starts an art collection and what happens to that collection when that collector is no longer able to be the steward and it passes on either to an heir, a surviving spouse, a foundation, or even an institution. How do you balance the priorities and the vision of the original collector with the continuity, the mission, and perhaps an evolving vision of the next collector or the subsequent collector? So I'm thrilled to be joined today in the first half of our program by three wonderful panelists that I'll introduce in a moment. And then in the second half of the program today, we are very honored to be joined by none other than Jack Shear from the Ellsworth Kelly Foundation. It's a very special year for them, and we're going to be talking about not only the theme of art and succession, but the Ellsworth Kelly Centennial. So again, just delighted to be with all of you today. So without further ado, as Hida said, I'm Drew Watson. I head up art services at Bank of America. We work with collectors, their families, and institutions on a variety of their banking needs, and including their art collections, planning around their art collections, lending, consignment advisory services, endowment management services, et cetera. On my left, I have Janne Sirén, who we're thrilled to be joining us today. He is the Peggy Pierce Elfvin Director of the Buffalo AKG Museum. You may know it by its former name as the Albright Knox. But Dr. Sirén is, of course, the Peggy Pierce Elfvin Director of the Buffalo AKG, where he's led the most significant campus expansion and raised $230 million for that institution. He's initiated major exhibitions and launched the pioneering Public Art Initiative. Prior to the Buffalo AKG, he served as director of the Helsinki and Tampere Art Museums and taught art history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, received his PhD from NYU, and serves as the president of the board of directors of Eschaton, the Anselm Kiefer Foundation. So thank you so much for being with us today. Rosemary Ringwald, who is a wonderful colleague of mine at Bank of America. She is managing director and wealth strategies advisor and head of art planning for the private bank. Rosemary and I have worked together. She is headquartered in Los Angeles and works with a lot of our clients to develop financial strategies to pursue their unique objectives, especially as it relates to their art collections. And then, last but certainly not least, we are also thrilled to be joined by Nick Hissam-Wynn, who grew up alongside one of the world's most renowned art collections. His proximity to this collection profoundly influenced his life, and he has gone on to profoundly influence his family's art collection. He is now director of the Wynn Fine Art, the Wynn family's public-facing collection and art gallery in Palm Beach, and he oversees the management and curation of various shows, auctions, handles private sales alongside his family, and he's also founder of Acteon Art. So thank you all again for being with us today.
Thank you.
So to kick off the conversation about art and succession, Janne, I wanted to bring you in to kind of opine on this first idea. As we were preparing for this discussion today, you were talking a bit about the legacy of the Buffalo AKG and really what makes it unique as a collecting institution. Your collection has come from really primarily three different sources. You were talking about artists, private collectors, and also the museum as its own collecting institution. And this is very much linked to the museum's broad definition of modern and contemporary art, and goes back all the way to the mid-19th century. So tell us a little bit, first of all, before we get into that topic, of why this is a special year for the Buffalo AKG. And then I would love to hear your thoughts about thinking about these three different types of collectors: artists, private collectors, and also the institution itself that make up your own collection. What have you observed from your perspective about the different approaches that are taken from these different types of collectors when it comes to building a collection?
That's a thick question, Drew. Thank you. Let me begin by, first of all, saying thank you for being here today. The Buffalo AKG is celebrating its 161st anniversary this year. We were incorporated in 1862 during the American Civil War. This makes us the 6th oldest art museum in the United States. There was nothing on Manhattan when the AKG was established in Buffalo in November, December of 1862. We are also really the first contemporary art museum in the country, meaning from the very beginning of our chapters of collecting, we were collecting contemporary art. So we've been at it now for 161 years. And in just 28 days, we will be opening our new campus, a $230 million capital campaign that I have not executed alone at all, but with a great team of individuals. It has been brought to completion, and the new campus opens on June 12th to the public. So welcome all to visit us. We'll be able to showcase a larger portion of our collection than ever before. When I started in Buffalo, I was puzzled by the fact that I found a Cézanne and a Monet on my office wall, and I thought this is some kind of a prank. Well, it wasn't. They just put them there because there wasn't anywhere else to put them. Now they are all on public view, and there is so much treasure to share with audiences from near and afar. Insofar as your question is concerned, the artist, the private collector, the institution, I hope I'm not being too audacious if I say that art as such doesn't exist. And I don't want to sound overly Heideggerian here, but the thingness of the thing only becomes an artwork through a network of players. And that network makes art be art. And that network includes, of course, the artist, or sometimes a collaborative of makers, a patron, an institution, the general public sphere. And depending on which time in history you look at, those players may evolve. But art as such, just as a thing, doesn't really exist. It's the electric current between different players that makes art be art. The first public art museum was established opened its doors to the public on August 10th, 1793. That was the Louvre. So as art museums, we're relatively young institutions. We've been around only for 230 years, starting with the Louvre and now evolving into all these different organizations around the world. And as institutions, we have missions that sometimes evolve and sometimes they stay a little bit more static. But I think that by default, the first collector of art is always the artist. Now, the artist is often also the most avid deaccessioner of art, because that's how an artist makes a living. But for an artist to part ways with art is also always not that easy, because works become dear to artists. It's not just like, let me produce so I can sell. Artists are the bravest people around there. They start each day with a revolution of sorts, because they have to somehow create something from nothing. And in that regard, I have previously and continue to say that artists are the bravest people around there. I think that an artist as a collector comes with its own dynamic, where an artist must live, but an artist must also exist in that network, in that electric current that I previously described, that defines the very essence and beingness of art. We know that from times immemorial, go back to ancient Egypt, the private collector was perhaps the pharaoh, or then it was the Hellenistic civic leaders of the city-states, or the emperors of Rome, or the dukes of Europe in the Middle Ages with their Kunstkameras, or cabinets of curiosities. And private collectors in that sense have been around, although the definition of what that private collector has of course evolved and changed over time. I think the primary difference between a private collector and an institutional collector is that a private collector can exercise more free will or decision-making over how he, she, or the family shapes the collection. There is a pursuit that can define it within a private sphere. When you come to institutions, whether it be the Louvre, an encyclopedic museum, or the Buffalo AKG, a museum that follows the lead of artists and tries to empower artists to reach their greatest potential. We are guided by missions, and our job is sort of to serve as the backstop, if you wish, to allow those missions to stay true and strong for as long as possible, because when we are true and strong with our missions, artists trust us, private collectors trust us, and even nations and the world trusts us. Recently, there was a study done about American public or institutions in America, and art museums and museums in general were ranked as the most trusted organizations in the country, far more so than the government, for example. I hope that there aren't too many elected officials present. I'm very grateful to elected officials for all that they do, but but I really think that art museums, in a world that's very volatile and where there is a lot of, let's say, news of different typologies out there, different truths, shall we say, we try to steer and keep a steady course, keep a firm hand on the rudder, at the same time as those of us who work in the contemporary realm want to be as closely attached to that courage that artists manifest every day that they do their work. So let me just, I've already spoken too much, I'm sure, but let me just close these notes here by saying that we've always collected art, and we like to say when the paint is still wet. We also like to say that we try to sniff out their aesthetic and artistic revolutions of tomorrow before tomorrow thinks of them as such. That's a hard thing to do in any field of human endeavor. But the first work that entered our collection was by Albert Bierstadt, a Hudson River School painter. He gifted the work to us in 1863, a year after we had been incorporated. And in his deed of gift, he wrote, and let me see if I can memorize this now, "I ask you to accept whatever is good in it," the painting, "as a sincere expression of my best wishes for the true and abundant success of the Academy," the AKG, "and as a small payment of the large debt that every artist owes to his or her profession." So if you think and break down that statement, the artist is giving something to the institution, to the museum. He wishes the institution success. He knows, in this case Bierstadt knows, that these things called art museums, of which there are only 5 others in the United States at the time, are important to the profession of artists. And he wishes true and abundant success. And he also says, "I'm grateful to be an artist. And the fact that I'm giving it to you is a small payment on that large debt that I have because I get to be an artist." In many ways, that statement by Bierstadt encapsulates what we as a museum want to be. Good stewards, strong mission. We work closely with collectors, private collectors, understanding that private collectors are more like a fast patrol boat. They can steer the course and change course, as well as artists who are the first collector by default, but also evolve through their careers.
I did not know much about the Buffalo AKG until I started speaking to Janne, and I was just completely blown away by your approach to art history and the legacy of the museum always having worked with living artists. You think of encyclopedic museums as only dealing with dead artists, which some people say are the best artists. I don't know if I necessarily agree. But it brings a completely different perspective, I think, to thinking about the historical through lines that we're seeing across different collecting categories, which again is something that I think is unique about TAFAP as well. Nick, I wanted to bring you in because speaking of working with living artists, this is a really important dynamic that you have brought to your own family's collection that I think started out maybe a bit more historical in nature, but really bringing in this new perspective and again, making these connections between different, the influence of different artists and how one kind of passed on different legacies to others. So talk to us a little bit just about how you started working with your family collection as the next generation and how you brought in this whole new perspective of bringing in working with living artists.
Sure. Well, I guess it started with actually working with the living artists. That's how we got into the family collection. We started with an emerging artist who was telling his story that was sort of akin to a Basquiat Warhol story with certain aesthetics and certain personal similarities to those artists. And we then started to represent him as sort of just emerging dealers when we were a little younger. And we started to build a market for the artists and tell their story, and then started to work with institutions and started to also realize how important the credibility of history was to the artists of today, to creating the art historical narrative and bringing it to contemporary artists where, as you said, Janne, working with living artists is something that is it's very interesting, it's very dynamic because obviously they're alive. So it's something that opens up a lot of doors, a lot of creativity and a larger discussion. And through working with those emerging artists, we then started to contextualize them with the family collection. For example, we were working with a British sculptor named Nick Hornby, who's he's in his 40s, and he was the winner of the Tate Triennial Prize in London, which is a very prestigious award where you go directly into the Tate from college, and all of the university students compete for it. And he's the winner, so he's a very, very talented artist, and he has enormous breadth of work. And he's very inspired by Matisse, Picasso, Leger, Henry Moore, and some of those artists we collect, and we have some of the best examples of those works. So being able to showcase an artist who's living and still has a lot of credibility in the museum and institutional level, and bring them to America and put them alongside, obviously, masterpieces by very famous artists, was a really cool thing to be able to do.
So, Rosemary, we'll take kind of a different perspective here, thinking about succession, right? I think that word means so many different things to different people. From the perspective of a wealth planner, talk to us a little bit about the typical plan that you see or strategies that are used, thinking about artists, private collectors, even sometimes institutions, foundations, et cetera, for art collections. I mean, is there even usually a plan?
There
How
is.
do people think about it?
So we have an estate exemption of $12,920,000 per person in the United States that you can use during your life or when you pass away. But for married artists and collectors, what we normally see is that they leave the artwork to their spouse. And they do this because they're for two reasons. A, when assets are included in your estate for estate tax purposes, they get a step up in basis to fair market value. So although you might have spent $100,000 buying a collection that's now worth $10 million, when you leave it to your spouse is going to receive those assets with a $10 million basis, not the $100,000. And so they can turn around and sell those assets and pay absolutely no tax. And what we know about selling appreciated artwork during your lifetime is that it's taxed at a higher tax rate than other types of assets. So when you sell your house, your stocks and bonds, you're taxed at a maximum rate for long-term capital gain purposes at 20%. Collectibles is always 28% when held long-term, plus the Medicare surtax of 3.8%, plus your state income taxes. So it's brutal, right? So the alternative also would be a marital trust. So we typically see an artist or collector, if they're on their second or third marriage, they might leave the artwork in a marital trust as opposed to outright to their spouse, and that's to give some controls on where it's gonna go when the surviving spouse passes away. So we also, in this case, are deferring our tax by giving it to our spouse. If you don't have a spouse, then you're going to have a tax on the excess over the $12,920,000, which we have currently as that estate exemption at 40%. So when I think about museums and I think about arts institutions, typically what they're asking me to do is to help them with their budgeting and planning for the near future. And obviously their goal is to sustain themselves as long as they can. And so I work with cash flow analysis to look at, let's say 5 to 10 years out, give me your estimate of what your budget is. They're obviously working with issues related to the stock market and whether or not they need to change their investment policy statement for the endowment so that they can sustain themselves longer.
And how does this kind of pair up with some of the non-tax issues that families are having to navigate? Because we always say that art is the most difficult asset to plan around, not necessarily because of the facts and figures, but because of some of the more qualitative elements.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to say is that we see also a lot of married collectors borrowing against their art during their lifetime because they don't want to sell, so that gives them access to the liquidity that they have without paying any tax, which they would otherwise have to pay. So that's very nice, and the surviving spouse can then sell assets and pay off the loan. But I think one of the biggest concerns is being fair and equal when we're talking about giving to children, and so that's the term I hear most from married collectors is they're thinking about their estate plan and saying, well, if I give even one Picasso to this child and another Picasso to this child, they might be worth the same fair market value on that date. But in the future, when we pass away as a couple, those Picassos might not be worth the same amount, and then we'll feel like we're not fair. And so one technique is to use an art LLC, is what we call it, essentially to set aside the pieces that we intend to give to our heirs, our children, into this art LLC. Some of it might be earmarked for donations to charitable organizations, museums. But the portion that we intend to go to the children, and we don't want them to sell it, so we put it in this LLC, essentially, and we can keep it in the family because we can give rights of first refusal to the other members of the LLC. There is, however, a case in 2017 that says, I can't really retain control over this LLC. If under the Sixth Circuit, it was a federal circuit case called Powell that said, if I retain any interest, then I might have it included in my estate. That's not what we want. So a lot of collectors, to be very cautious, are essentially earmarking those pieces, giving them to the children through the LLC as interest in the LLC or through irrevocable trusts that the children are beneficiaries of. And then, of course, they want to have it on their walls. So they lease it back. And that's a typical strategy that we see. It's not without risk. It requires qualified appraisals. The IRS has never said that there's a fair market value, rental value for artwork. And I will tell you that the appraisal houses, qualified appraisal houses can come up with valuations for this, usually a percentage of the value on an annual basis. But there has to be a lease agreement, and you need to work with a very solid attorney as well.
So many things to think about.
There are a lot.
It's not simple. But kind of hearkening back to this idea of legacy, kind of thinking about some of the more ambiguous kind of qualitative elements that you have to think through as a collector, which I think is one of the things, legacy and what your objective is, that really kind of helps you determine which strategy is right for you. Nick, I wanted to bring you back in to talk about the legacy of your family's collection. You, I think, are in somewhat of an atypical situation because you've had the wonderful opportunity of starting to work very closely with and shape your family's collection with your other family members, not through kind of generational succession, if you will. What do you think is going to be the lasting legacy of your family's collection?
Well, Rosemary, as you said, it's very complicated and every family is unique, and the situation with all of the different works of art are very unique. Our collection was built always with a public-facing aspect. So since opening the Golden Nugget Hotel in Las Vegas in the 70s, and we exhibited a Golden Nugget show of actual pieces of gold, all the way to the Bellagio Museum of Fine Art in 1997, when we started collecting Monet, Picasso, Modigliani, some of the most famous artists that we know of today. There's always been a public-facing aspect to it and a community aspect to it, where we're inviting people to come and share the art with us and participate in the art. And that has now started to extend to museums and also foundations and philanthropy. So there's a lot of different avenues. It's always hard to tell because we're all still doing this as a family, but we do have a Win Family Foundation, and we use art as a medium for education, also fundraising for numerous charities. Right now we're opening a Win Hospital in Utica, which will be over 700,000 feet of hospital complex with 373 beds. So that's sort of our latest charitable endeavor. And we use the art creatively, either on the business side with private sales or in the hotels for a public exhibit, or directly with the charities to sort of fit into the mission of the Win Family Foundation and to publicly exhibit the art and share it with the community.
That's amazing. So you're really getting the collection out there. You're really putting it to work for the benefit of the community.
Yes.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So Janne, I will give you the last word today. I'm really kind of building upon some of the things that Nick has said in dealing with the Wynn family collection. I wanted to turn back to you again for the museum perspective and this idea of balancing an individual collector's legacy while maintaining the continuity of an organization's mission, especially a large, complex organization like the Buffalo AKG. How do you do it?
I think that from the very beginning, the museum has been, its mission has been defined by a strong partnership between administrators of the museum and private collectors attached to the museum. So if we take A. Conger Goodyear, chair of the museum's art committee from 1912 to 1926, he was responsible really for introducing to the museum and to American audiences, for that matter, French modernist art, which was not being acquired by other institutions at the time. Fast forward several decades, A. Conger Goodyear in 1929 becomes the founding president of MoMA, nominates Alfred Barr as the first director of the Museum of Modern Art, and lives here in the city. But when he passes, he remembers Buffalo and more than 200 works, including things like Yellow Christ, Manoa Tupapao, and the list goes on, by Gauguin, Frida Kahlo's self-portrait with a monkey. You know, they come to Buffalo because of that strong relationship, that bond between A. Conger Goodyear and then director of the museum, Cornelia Bentley Sage Quinton, the first woman director in the United States, probably in the world. Then Mr. Knox, Seymour H. Knox Jr., and Gordon Smith as director. You know, they basically defined what it meant to be on the cutting edge of developing a collection of abstract expressionist art as abstract expressionism was happening. I mean, just to name one example, Ellsworth Kelly's New York, New York from 1957, acquired in 1959, or Rothko's Orange and Red, painted in 56, acquired in 56. And that was a partnership between Knox and Gordon Smith. And these partnerships between visionary private collectors and curators and directors of the museum have really defined who we are. And we salute that partnership, we steward that partnership, and that partnership really extends to artists as well, because when you think of someone like Clifford Still, who was not the easiest of artists perhaps to work with, you know, he closed the door on many, and then we organize his first career retrospective in 1959, and 4 years later he gifts us 31 of his works from the late 1930s through the early 60s, really the career-defining works that he wanted to have at the Buffalo AKG. They will all be on view, by the way, if anybody wants to come and see them. Or Natalie and Irving Foreman, the Panza collection, of which we hold a good portion of. And of course, Jeffrey Gunlock, who has gifted us $65 million in order for us to build this new campus. But Jeffrey, while his collecting practice is still continuing, is certainly one of the most articulate and specific collectors of mid-century American and international art. I mean, his collection is exquisite. And these are the types of partnerships that we have had both with artists, like Clifford Still or Marisol, who gifted her entire estate to the museum at her death, and we are now the largest custodian of Marisol works in the world, thanks to that bequest, or private individuals. So I think it's about partnership, it's about trust, and it's about knowing for artists and collectors and other partners to know that we've got the hand on the rudder, it's steady, you can trust us, but we're also trying to be as courageous as you.
Courage is a theme that has come up a couple of times today, and it is certainly something that is required of a collector, whether you're a private collector or an institution, and certainly of artists, who, as you said at the beginning, have to wake up every day and create something from nothing, and that's why we're all here. We'll have to leave it there for today for the first half of our program, but I thank you so much, Janne, Rosemary, and Nick for joining us in this discussion today. Please join me in a round of applause for our panelists. And we're going to have a brief reset of the stage and welcome our next guest up, the one and only Jack Shear. Okay, please welcome Jack Shear to the stage. Thank you, Jack.
Welcome. I actually probably don't need this because my voice is like an opera singer, but I'll do it just for the recording.
Jack, thank you so much for joining us today. It is such a treat to have you here. We know that you have a lot going on this year. With
Understatement.
Yes. Not only the Ellsworth Kelly Centennial, but you have a big birthday coming up. What are you doing to celebrate?
Friends are coming in from all over the place to have dinner with me on Sunday on Mother's Day. So big 7-0.
And I heard you, I think you mentioned, yeah, that deserves a round of applause. Go for it. And I think you mentioned that you may have bought yourself an early birthday present at the fair.
I did.
Yep.
I bought a De Chirico from 1950. Ellsworth gave me, I was trying to remember the date. Ellsworth gave me a De Chirico for one of my past birthdays. So it's joining that. So now I have two.
It's amazing. So for those of you who don't know Jack, who absolutely needs no introduction, he is, of course, the president of the Ellsworth Kelly Foundation. He is Ellsworth Kelly's surviving spouse. He is also a collector in and of his own right, has an exquisite drawings collection that spans how many centuries?
16th century to contemporary works.
I had the good fortune of seeing some of it at the David Nolan Gallery a couple of months ago, and it's just beautiful.
And also during the pandemic, there was a large show at the Drawing Center that was in 3 iterations. The first one was my take on my collection. The second was Arlene Schechtig, who did an incredible job, a sculptor. Very interesting approach. And the third was Jared Ernest, a journalist, an author, an artist in his own right. Each iteration took a real special look at the collection and showed it in different ways. And it was part of what I like about showing art anywhere in the world, because it changes wherever it is. It changes who the audience is. It changes, people who traditionally go to museums. A drawing center is a different kind of experience than you have going to, like, let's say, the Metropolitan, where I'm always a little, I guess I shouldn't be critical, but that the drawings are in the hallway. It's just always sort of, there's too many people walking back and forth to actually look at the drawings at the Met. And so I'm sorry, Max, if you're listening.
Well, but what's so interesting about drawings is that there's such an immediacy to them. They're kind of more intimate. You get more insight into the artist's process, and so you feel almost closer in a way than a large finished work. I don't know if that's what draws you to drawings.
It does, but this segues into the gift that I gave to a number of institutions this year. It's Ellsworth Kelly Centennial, and Ellsworth always believed that great art ended up in great museums. Sometimes it took some time to get there, and he was always a little impatient, so he actually gave art during his time to a number of museums and institutions. Good example is there was a painting that the Museum of Modern Art has that was a gift of Ellsworth's. I think it was gifted in 1969 or 1970. It's Colors for a Large Wall. It's 64 panels. His dealer at the time, Sidney Janis, said, "We can sell this to the Tate. The Tate wants to buy this painting." And Ellsworth said, "I would rather give it to the Modern than sell it to the Tate," because he knew that's where he wanted it to be. And that's the story about Bierstadt is incredible, because he wasn't as eloquent as that, but I think the the sincere meaning of what he wrote back so many years ago is exactly what I think artists who give works that are precious, that are dear to themselves. Ellsworth really kept a lot of his work from his Paris years I don't know what people know about Ellsworth and his life, but after the war, he was in the Ghost Army in World War II. He got out, went to the Boston Museum School, decided that it wasn't the right place for him to be, because basically I think 3 other artists got scholarships and he didn't. And he was a little pissed off, so he said, I'm leaving Boston. And I said, that's probably the best thing that ever happened to you, because those artists, although they're good artists, became Boston artists. You know, they were so mired in the mud of Boston. He goes to Paris in 1948 and stays there until 1954. Creates a large body of work that's amazing on every level. It has a quality that they're not series necessarily, but they're ideas that he's just churning out, just incredible amounts of drawings, looking at the city in a whole different kind of way. And he gets to, at the end of his stay, he got sick, convalescing, and he wrote his parents that he'd like to get $200 for his passage back on a ship back to New York, and $200 for his paintings to send them back. His parents said, here's $200, leave the paintings there. I mean, I don't know if I'm really going off topic, but I just really wanted to tell you how important Ellsworth thought of his works, and that he kept this group of works and like almost letting none of them out in his early years. He at one point has a show in Paris called The French Years, 1948 to 54, and starts thinking about what happens to these paintings that he did there, and slowly starts selling things. San Francisco bought a large group of them. The Chicago Art Institute has some examples from that period. Philadelphia, he loaned, I think, 12 or 14 paintings to the Philadelphia Art Museum, and Darnacourt was the director there. They've been up, I think, for about maybe 20 years, where he has a room that has just been endowed, so that room will continue in perpetuity. There are some exciting things happening, and the Museum of Modern Art, of course, is one of our favorite institutions. I remember at Ellsworth's Memorial, I called it the Vatican of the art world, with both good and bad ideas about what that meant. So what's gone on this year is I've looked at all the institutions that have works of Ellsworth, especially 4 institutions: the Chicago Art Institute, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Philadelphia Museum of Art, and Museum of Modern Art here in New York, and in a certain way, the Whitney. These are institutions that have helped Ellsworth. The Whitney was the first museum to buy a painting of Ellsworth in 1956 called Atlantic. I invited, am I talking how I should be talking?
This is great. We want to hear
okay.
What's going on.
But I guess I'm not talking about art and money. So
We don't care about money.
Oh, okay. I love that. Okay, first of all, let me tell you that we have all our assets with Bank of America, both the foundation and that's a disclaimer.
And full transparency.
Yeah. Full
transparency. Thank you.
So I always gave. Okay, let's back up a little bit. I met Ellsworth in 1982, moved upstate to his studio and his house in 1984. We lived together since '84. got married in 2012 when it was New York State you could get married and Domo hadn't happened yet. So I thought that was pretty courageous of Ellsworth. Of course, I could never ask him to marry me, so the age difference was extreme. But I think he was looking for someone to carry on his legacy, to carry on his vision. Very important to him. I mean, we talked about his death probably daily, which is not a bad thing. I mean, I'm a Taoist and I sort of meditate on death every day. So it's an interesting dilemma when you have to have assets and you have to have artwork that you love or children you love, whatever. It's important to think about it in that way.
Absolutely. I mean, I've learned just so much in some of the brief conversations that we've had about what Ellsworth must have been like as a human being. And of course, I didn't have the good fortune of ever meeting him, but you're of course now carrying on his legacy, and it seems to me that it is really one of generosity. Given all of the philanthropic work that you are doing, both in your local community and more broadly, Ellsworth, as you were telling me, was passionate and adamant about supporting the museum community.
Mm.
And as these are your words, not mine, he was all about taking the me out of the art and really focusing his efforts on, again, those around him, the community of museums, and then, other people. So
Well, I think a lot of that means the me out of art, that he wanted the art to be the thing that you looked at.
Yeah.
He wasn't about cult of personality like some artists are, which there's nothing wrong with it. It's just a different kind of way of experiencing one's reality. But he never wanted a house that you could go into and say, this is where Ellsworth Kelly slept or this is where he ate. That wasn't important to him. The studio was his heaven on earth. So that was really important to Ellsworth.
how does the collection, of course, when Ellsworth passed away, you became the steward of a vast body of work that he created. How does that body of work play a role in what you're trying to do with the foundation?
So the foundation is different than me.
Okay.
And
Yes.
my own,
Yes.
our relationship. The foundation was established in 1991. It started out very simply as a way to, Ellsworth didn't have any heirs, didn't have a family that he wanted to leave anything to, so this was a way to protect the work after his death at that time. It started funny. I mean, I think the first year we had to give $30,000 away, and Ellsworth said, we're going to give $31,000 grants. And I said, no, we're giving two $15,000 grants because you can't even buy stamps for $1,000. So one of the early ideas also is that half of our money stayed in Columbia County in upstate New York where we live, which is really important, I think, because he called Columbia County his home since 1970. And it's a relatively rural area and doesn't have a lot of foundations. So we did a number of initiatives with schools and starting arts programs that were funded, that they could bring teachers or dancers or people into the schools. And the other half was for conservation, which is a very leadership role in art. Your name doesn't go next, if you conserve a painting or works on paper, your name doesn't go on the little label next to the painting. So it's something that I applaud. Okay, here we go again. So full transparency, I applaud Bank of America for what they've done. And actually, they restored a painting when Ellsworth was still alive. It's now at the Boston Museum. And it's a 5-panel picture, and it is beautiful. Ellsworth did repaint. It was damaged. It was in a bank that the Bank of America acquired. The middle panel was damaged, so Ellsworth agreed to repaint it, and they had conservation done on the other 4 panels. The idea now, especially since COVID, I think that we understood that the role of the museums had changed, that they needed support. So we actually changed